Imagine you're in Subura, Rome's decadent entertainment district. You're a senator. These streets are infamous for their depravity, but what you witness tonight is not something even Rome can tolerate. In a dimly lit brothel, a woman offering a different service catches your attention. Her face is hastily covered with cheap makeup, meant to conceal her true nature. But her features, oh, those features, they don't burn. For a moment, your heart tightens. Because this woman is no ordinary woman. This woman is Messalina, the Roman empress. Not a woman sold into slavery, not a helpless woman, not one kidnapped or silenced. Exactly. The most powerful woman in the Roman Empire is here of her own free will. She sneaks out of the palace at night, seeking humiliation and danger at the end of anonymous encounters. Her aim is not to conceal, but to push boundaries. She stands alongside ordinary prostitutes, competing against blows and striving to prove that no woman can surpass her in sexual endurance. Do you think you know the decadence of Rome? Messalina's story is a record of an explosion that would shame even Rome. Next to her, even Caligula seems disciplined and restrained. For Messalina not only abused her power, but she transformed sexuality into a systematic weapon. A weapon used to control the palace, eliminate enemies, spread fear, and ultimately seal her own demise. In 38 AD, Rome celebrated an imperial wedding. Not everything was perfect. Messalina, only 15 years old, married Claudius in a ceremony. This marriage was a symbol of her sacred status among the Romans, nobility, fertility, and the continuation of her divine lineage. She was young. She was beautiful. She was expected to come from a prominent patrician family, and she was seen as a womb that would give legitimate heirs to the empire. Claudius was 3 years old. He was a man who had been belittled and ridiculed throughout his life due to international obstacles. Sources write that he accepted this marriage almost gratefully. In the course of Rome, it was an unexpected reward shown to him. In official records, Messalina was flawless. Historians of the time described her with classical Roman beauty, pale skin, light hair, and a cool grace stemming from an aristocratic education. She performed her duties flawlessly. She bore Claudius 2 children. She was silent, dignified, and obedient, as required at state ceremonies. Roman society clearly divided women. Virtuous wives and mothers were sacred. Prostitutes and women of the entertainment world were at the very bottom. An empress had to be the living embodiment of moral perfection. Even the slightest rumor was unacceptable. That is why Messalina's secret life represented not just immorality, but a direct threat. The problem wasn't scandal. The problem was the foundations of the empire. Behind the marble walls of the Palatine Palace, a reality was taking shape that the public should never see. This young woman, who during the day acted like an empress devoted to the gods in religious ceremonies, at night wandered the darkest streets of Rome. She was planning secret nights that would shock even Roman aristocrats accustomed to excess, meticulously building a boundless downfall. This is not a story of secret depravity. This is a document of how power decays when left unchecked, and Rome will pay a very heavy price for it. The transformation was not sudden. During Messalina's first year as empress, palace servants began to notice small but disturbing details. Guard duties were changed without justification. Guards were dismissed at unusual hours under the pretext of tiredness. Then, the empress would leave her chambers, disguised in simple clothes. She would blend into the night. Initially, these escapades were interpreted as an innocent rebellion against palace protocol by a young woman, an attempt to breathe outside the stifling rules. However, it soon became clear that these nighttime walks were not accidental. Messalina's nights were less a spontaneous escape and more part of a systematic and disturbing preparation. She began observing the daily routines of the prostitutes in Rome. She studied where they worked, whom they served, and at what times they attracted customers. This was no mere curiosity, nor was it the perspective of a stranger trying to understand the world of entertainment. She was conducting a methodical and cold-blooded investigation, much like planning a military expedition. The first documented incident dates back to 40 AD, to the Saturnalia festivals. In these days, when social roles were temporarily reversed and moral boundaries were consciously relaxed, Claudius was preoccupied with official religious ceremonies. Messalina, disguised as an ordinary citizen, descended to Subura. Initially, this was presented as a desire to see how the common people lived. However, this curiosity soon transformed into an obsession with establishing dominance over professional entertainers. The contemporary historian Tacitus records the whispers circulating within the palace. According to these accounts, Messalina approached a brothel owner and offered to work anonymously for a single night. The brothel owner mistook the woman for a noblewoman seeking only excitement and accepted her offer. What happened that night, however, was beyond anything the establishment was accustomed to. Messalina served more clients than even the most experienced employees. She displayed a persistence and inexhaustible drive that surprised even professionals accustomed to demand. When dawn broke and the other women stopped working, she still wanted to continue. More clients, more challenges, the desire to prove that an empress was superior to an ordinary prostitute. The brothel owner finally stopped her by force. But there was no turning back. Messalina had found what she was looking for. In the months following her first experience, it became clear that these behaviors were not accidental. Messalina systematized her nights. She established a network of servants who would safely escort her out of the palace. She had disguises that completely changed her identity and false names that allowed her to move freely in the Roman underworld. This wasn't uncontrolled madness. It was a conscious and calculated scheme. However, ordinary prostitution didn't satisfy Messalina's competitive nature. She began organizing competitions with Rome's most renowned brothel owners. Large sums of money were on the line for serving more clients in a single night than any professional. These competitions were secret, but as secret as they were also very popular. Wealthy Romans gathered to watch their empress humiliate herself for entertainment. The most infamous encounter occurred in 41 AD. Messalina challenged Scylla, one of Rome's most famous prostitutes, to a test of endurance. The rules were simple. Whoever served the most clients from sunset to sunrise would win. The prize was a fortune measured in gold. The venue filled with Roman nobles. They placed bets while watching their emperor's wife in the arena like a gladiator. Scylla, with years of experience, carefully controlled the pace of the night. She proceeded, conserving her strength. By dawn, she had served 25 clients. She was exhausted, but she felt victorious. For Messalina, however, this was only the beginning. Even after her rival withdrew, she did not stop. According to historical records, she received more than 30 men that night and only stopped when there were no more clients. This was far more than pleasure. This was a record of how an unrestrained impulse, combined with control, can lead to destruction. There were volunteers, but there was no victory to celebrate. The Romans watched in silence as they witnessed a scene unlike anything they had ever seen before in their history. There was no applause. There was no joy. Only blank faces trying to comprehend what they were witnessing. Because what they were watching was not the story of a helpless woman forced into humiliation. This was the story of the world's most powerful woman consciously choosing humiliation. The psychological impact was devastating. Messalina discovered that her imperial status didn't lessen the humiliation. On the contrary, it made it even more provocative. The deeper the chasm between public honor and the degradation in her private life, the more intense the satisfaction she derived. This contrast, instead of stopping her, pushed her further. But these open contests were only the beginning of Messalina's descent into a systematic perversion that would threaten the foundations of the Roman state. If the prostitution contests shock you, you haven't yet reached the real darkness. Because when Messalina decided to transform her sexual obsessions from a temporary madness into a permanent order, all boundaries would completely disappear. What I'm about to tell you will make what you just heard seem like an innocent experiment. Before we get to the most disturbing part, if you're ready to continue, subscribe and click the like button. Leave a comment below where you're watching from. It's still chilling how people from all over the world connect with each other through the same curiosity about the darkest aspects of human history. The next stage transformed the Roman empress from a mere sexual rival into a far more dangerous entity. In 42 AD, Messalina crossed a threshold. She was no longer just a scandalous figure, but a tangible threat to imperial security. She established what historians would later call the most audacious criminal undertaking in Roman history. A luxurious brothel operating under imperial protection, employing aristocratic women and serving the city's most powerful men. This establishment was disguised as a private club, hosting exclusive gatherings in a lavish villa near the campus marshes. From the outside, it appeared to be an elite socialite haunt. Inside, however, a trap was being set, reaching into the heart of the state. Messalina used imperial authority to recruit participants. Noble women were forced to join the establishment under the threat of political or financial ruin for their families. The impression of voluntary participation was, in reality, nothing more than coercion backed by the full weight of the imperial throne. But Messalina's true genius lay in her selection of clients. Unlike ordinary prostitutes who served random clients, she specifically targeted senators, military commanders, and wealthy men. Men with state secrets, illicit plots, and personal weaknesses. Every encounter was carefully recorded by undercover servants. Conversations were listened to, weaknesses identified, and information gathered for future use. Messalina had effectively established a honey trap network. She now knew which senators were plotting against imperial policies, which commanders' loyalty was questionable, which merchants were evading taxes, which fortunes were growing through shady means. The most intimate secrets of the Roman Empire were now in the empress's hands, and this information posed a far more destructive threat to Rome than prostitution. This network of information gave Messalina unprecedented power over people she would normally have to govern alongside the emperor. Her methods were not crude. They were subtle, planned, and psychologically destructive. She patiently observed her targets at state ceremonies, identified their weaknesses, and then had them invited to private meetings at her villa. Once inside, the process unfolded in stages. The entertainment became increasingly eccentric, and boundaries gradually blurred. At the climax, encounters involving aristocratic women took place. Identities were only revealed after irreversible acts were committed and meticulously documented. The impact was calculated. The realization that the empress herself, or the wives and daughters of her political allies, had engaged in unwitting relationships, established a multi-layered blackmail mechanism that created absolute silence and obedience among the victims. Messalina transformed sexual shame directly into political control. Thus, she created a vast network of compliant officials who dared not defy her will. But the most disturbing aspect of the operation was how it shattered the fundamental bonds that held Roman society together. Aristocratic women were forced to betray their class. Political leaders were compelled to act against their principles, and sacred relationships like marriage and family were reduced to instruments of manipulation. Soon the effects became visible. Foreign ambassadors began reporting policy deviations that lacked logical explanation. Military appointments were metrics based on securing the empress's support rather than merit. Trade agreements enriched individuals and groups whose connection to imperial interests was unclear. Decision-making processes were silently eroded in the shadow of a brothel madam married to the emperor. Yet even this systematic corruption would pale in comparison to Messalina's next move. She decided that the secret operation was no longer satisfying enough. By 44 AD, the appetite for power and depravity had reached a point where it could no longer be satisfied behind closed doors. This time, she did not hide. She began staging carefully orchestrated public spectacles that combined entertainment with political theater. She forced the Roman elite to participate in humiliating scenes that reinforced her dominance over the empire. These were not spontaneous parties. They were planned displays of power presented in the guise of religious festivals. Messalina imposed the participation of senators, their wives, and high-ranking officials as a civic duty, claiming to honor various gods and goddesses. Rome was no longer merely governed. It was directed, suppressed, and disintegrating from within. Initially, everything was formal religious ceremonies, but this form quickly eroded. Over time, the scenes transformed into systematic humiliation. Messalina had developed methods to transform these gatherings from respectable rituals into something more sinister. The ceremonies began with traditional rituals. Then, elements claimed to be ancient and authentic were gradually added. By the time the participants realized the truth, it was too late. They were considered to have willingly participated in acts that violated every principle of Roman morality. To object was tantamount to an open confession. There was no turning back. At this point, Messalina's psychological manipulation reached its peak. She understood that publicly humiliating aristocratic men and women created a shared bond of shame that permanently silenced them. This bond was stronger than loyalty. Everyone attending the meetings became complicit in perpetuating the lie that what was happening was not imperial entertainment, but legitimate religious ceremonies. The darkest accounts recount that Messalina forced her political rivals to perform against each other, and that she watched and commented on these scenes. Senators who opposed imperial policies were punished by being stripped of their honor in front of their colleagues, their authority irrevocably damaged. Messalina had discovered that sexual humiliation was more effective than execution in silencing opposition. Death created resistance. Shame created silence. But perhaps the most disturbing rupture occurred with the involvement of young people in the process. Court records show that adolescent sons and daughters of prominent families were summoned to these ceremonies under the pretext of religious legitimacy. Raised in unquestioning obedience to imperial authority, these young people became unwilling witnesses and instruments of their own exploitation. Messalina had set a perfect trap. Opposing her required confessions that would not only expose one's own complicity, but also ruin the entire family line. Parents could not protect their children without revealing their own roles. Political leaders could not accuse the empress without exposing their own complicity. Thus, a systematic network of blackmail was established, encompassing the entire ruling class of Rome. Messalina was virtually untouchable. Outside observers began to notice the change. Foreign ambassadors reported a strange transformation in Roman officials. Once self-assured senators appeared tense and submissive in diplomatic negotiations. Military commanders were distracted and hesitant to make decisions. Rome's leadership was no longer governed by the sword, but by a tool that controlled human behavior more effectively than military force. Sexual shame. By 48 AD, Messalina's obsession with power and scandal crossed an irreversible threshold. She took a step that even Romans accustomed to imperial excesses recoiled in horror. While Emperor Claudius was inspecting grain shipments in Ostia, Messalina held a full-fledged wedding with the young and handsome Senator Silius, whom she had been pursuing for months. This was not a secret affair, nor was it a symbolic ritual. It was a valid Roman marriage, complete with religious rites, official witnesses, and legal contracts. Messalina declared that she had severed her ties with the emperor, but she announced her marriage to another man while retaining her title as empress. The resulting legal and political situation was astonishing. Roman law recognized the new marriage as valid, but simultaneously still recognized her as Claudius' wife. This contradiction was like a knife plunged into the heart of the state. The wedding quickly turned into a celebration lasting several days. A significant portion of the Roman aristocracy witnessed these scenes. And finally, the fact that Messalina was no longer hiding behind private pleasures or religious pretexts was accepted. This was a clear challenge to the emperor's authority and the stability of the empire. During this period, Messalina's psychological state shows a complete detachment from reality. She began referring to Silius as emperor and herself as empress. Apparently, she believed that she could replace Claudius through the strength of her will and the obedience provided by her network of blackmail. She issued orders in Silius' name and planned a formal coronation ceremony to legitimize their rule. Initially flattered by the empress's attention, the young senator soon found himself in the midst of a nightmare where lust for power and sexual obsession intertwined. He had become the focus of Messalina's ultimate fantasy. This was no longer merely a matter of desire. In her twisted vision, the entire political order of the Roman Empire would be reshaped. Historical records show that Claudius began to consider escape routes, but soon realized he had become a pawn in this game. Moreover, the emperor was unaware of his wife's marriage until loyal free men risked their lives to reveal the truth. His initial reaction was denial. Even for Messalina, polygamy in the imperial office seemed inconceivable. But as witness testimonies and official documents accumulated, Claudius realized this was not merely a personal betrayal. This was a potential civil war. The response was swift and brutal. Claudius returned to Rome with his loyal troops and caught Messalina in the gardens where she was celebrating her new marriage. Contemporary accounts portray her final moments as a state where defiance and pure horror intertwine. She realized that the order she had established through blackmail and sexual control was facing something more powerful than herself, the empire's survival instinct. The execution was swift, but the actual erasure was systematic. By order of Claudius, Messalina's name was erased from all public monuments. Her statues were destroyed, her depictions obliterated. Her memory was officially condemned with damnatio memoriae. Even mentioning her existence was considered treason. The woman who tried to control the empire with sexual power was ultimately silenced by the most absolute form of state power. Her death symbolized the end of an era in Rome when sexual scandals had almost replaced political authority. And only one lesson remains. When power is built on moral decay, it is ultimately swallowed up by the darkness it created. If this brief glimpse into the dark, hidden corners of history deeply affected you, now is the time to explore further. Click the subscribe button and let's uncover another shocking chapter that history has tried to erase. We will peel back the layers of the past, revealing forgotten truths and bringing silenced voices back to life. Countless stories remain hidden, and you could be a witness to these secrets.